Hi everyone, it's Ryan here. Hope you're doing well, guys. That you had a good Christmas. That you're looking forward to the New Year's, and despite this complicated context that we live in. So I hope that you and your family are safe. And if you're looking for some holiday reading, don't forget that I have a book out, The Interview. If you're into Kafka, Dostoevsky, Albert Camus, Hermann Hesse, and other wonderful INFJ or INFP writers, but a book that would appeal to anything with an interest in psychology, personality, and slightly magical realist fiction. The links are down below in the description box. Thank you very much. So in this video, I wanted to tackle a number of fallacies that I see people make all the time, really, in discussions about MBTI, the typology of based on the Jungian theory. You might have noticed that on certain forums or certain discussions on YouTube, certain discussions don't seem to be going anywhere, or people seem to be contradicting one another, or they both seem to be right, but they don't agree on things. And you might be asking yourself, like, why is that the case? Why aren't people able to, agree on a particular conclusion regarding someone's type? You see that a lot in the comment section to the personality database website, for a lot of profiles. And I had been thinking for a while of making a video about the four most common types of mistakes, argumentative mistakes or fallacies that people make without realizing it, that leads ultimately to a distorted conclusion and to a spurious resolution or an absence of resolution of an argument or a conversation about someone's type. So let's get into it. The first one, which is obviously the most common of all, also the easiest to avoid if you know a little bit about MBTI, is the dichotomy fallacy. And what I call the dichotomy fallacy is the tendency that people have of seeing the main division between types as a division between P and J, the letter P and the letter J, with P types being expected to be into improvisation, to be into not having structure, being disorganized, more creative, and so on. And J types being more organized, more austere, less creative, more into executive kind of roles, which is obviously not true. The PJ distinction, as you know, only tells you what dominance, what your main extroverted function is, whether it's a judgment function or perception function. That's all it does. So it has nothing to do with the difference between structure and improvisation or openness, even though in practice it's possible that P types tend to be a bit more free floating and open, and J types are more organized. Note also in relation to the dichotomy fallacy that it affects the distinction between N and S, and also between T and F, because if you only look at the dichotomy, you might not realize that certain types have actually their N and S functions quite close in their stack, like let's say auxiliary and tertiary, like an INTP, for example, who might have like a very strong SI, almost as strong as their NE. And as for the TNF distinction, again, it's the same thing, if you purely consider the difference in terms of dichotomies, you might not realize that an INFJ could have like a TI that's almost as strong as their FE, for example. And that's a very useful way to distinguish an INFJ from an INFP, by the way, because an INFP has their T function is inferior, so their T function should actually be quite weaker. Now, moving on to the second fallacy, which I think in a way is a fallacy that is almost as common and more dangerous because most of the time people don't realize that they're doing that. I call this fallacy the content function fallacy. Now, the content function fallacy is the following. People all too often, when they're trying to figure out someone's type, they pay attention to what the person says. the content of the person's sentences, and also the contents, of their worldview and their actions. So they might say, oh, like this person, their opinions are often quite harsh and very logical, and they're not particularly altruistic, and in what they say and what they do, and therefore, all this content about the person's life, assuming that it is real and objective, will lead people to usually say this person must be T. And on the other hand, if the person appears to be very empathetic in what they say and appears to, help the poor a lot, or, donate to NGOs and be involved in humanitarian causes, they will tend to be associated with the letter F. And this is, a view that is actually very promoted by websites like 16 Personalities and other websites, because this is what they will tell you, because these are things that can be easily related to, but actually they're kind of false and wrong. None of the content of a person's life is directly an indication of their preference for, say, the F or T function. What you have to focus on is not the content of a person's life, the contextual expression, but the functional expression. How does a person relate to others? What do they favor? Do they favor extroverted feeling, or do they favor extroverted thinking? Do they favor introverted thinking? Do they favor introverted feeling? What is the function they manifest? And the function that they manifest will only indirectly come across in what they say, or the kind of hobbies they have, or the kind of what they do in their spare time. What transpires directly is the expression of that function, and that's something that you need to study. You need to study carefully what are the typical manifestations of those functions, but not the content. It's not about a person's opinion, it's how they manifest their functional stack. So you could have someone who's like extremely tolerant and promoting, peace among people, and in their language, they argue against conflicts, for example. And yet in practice, if they were ever to get into conflict, you see that they would be calm and logical, and that they would not get too flustered, right? So someone who appears to be like maybe, a feeling user because of the content of what they say, is actually maybe a thinking user. Although they could also be an extroverted feeler, but that's beside the point. So always make sure that you don't confuse the content with the function. The function is not the content, and what you need to focus on is the function, not the content. Now, a third example of fallacy that people make a lot in discussions is what I call the fallacy of the isolated example. Now, the isolated example fallacy is one that you will be quite familiar with. We all always, at least occasionally, fall prey to that fallacy. It's the fallacy of saying, I must be a feeler because at that point I did this, or that person is, that person must be a thinker because that's how they relate to that particular individual in their family. And they give a strong, potent, striking example to back it up. And because it's like this strong example and just one thing that gets buried in your mind, you'd find it convincing, but actually it's not convincing. And the reason why it's not convincing is because an isolated example, whether it's of a temporal nature, this person behaved like this over a week, or that person, or whether it's not a temporal nature, it's like a discrete kind of part of their life, like they relate to that person in that way, or they have this particular opinion. If you lose sight of the whole picture, you always need to have in mind, when you're trying to type someone, the entire spectrum of their life. How does everything relate together? And they've never fall to the temptation of just looking at one particular aspect and extrapolating everything else from it, even if that aspect seems very strong to you, even if that aspect seems very dominant to you. You always need to look at the whole in order to make sense of the parts. Okay, so the fallacy of the isolated example, very common. Be careful. And now, to wrap it up, one of my favorite fallacies, I should not say my favorite fallacies, but the fallacy that I enjoy pointing out in others the most, maybe with a little bit of a drop of perverse pleasure, you never know, is what I call the circularity fallacy. It's very common as well, particularly, and that's something I've noticed, particularly in people who are almost too well versed in MBTI. They know so much about the theory of MBTI that they end up using certain parts of the theory against other parts of the theory, or sometimes in support of faulty, like whenever a particular prediction of the theory fails, they use another section of the theory to explain in an ad hoc fashion, justify why it failed, and making in the process the predictions unfalsifiable and the theory pseudoscientific. So if the best way to turn Myers-Briggs into a pseudoscientific mess is to fall for the circularity fallacy. And I think the most common form that this fallacy takes is what I would call the shadow circularity fallacy. So it's when you rely on the theory of the shadow functions to justify why, in the case of a particular person, there is a failure of the theory to predict behavior in terms of functions. So imagine that you're typing someone as an INTP and you predict TIUs, and you see that there is not TIUs in a particular instance or a series of instances, but what you see instead is TE. Well, best way to actually make keep the theory scientific is to say, well, in this case the theory fails, and that's fine. MBTI is not a perfect theory. If you want it to be scientific, you have to be ready to admit that it is not perfect and that it can actually fail, it has limitations, and it can only attain X degree of precision, accuracy. Okay? Now, if you want to make it pseudoscientific because you think that actually makes it stronger, even though the opposite is true, what you will do is say, well, that person must be stressed, or that person must be in their shadow mode, and that's why they're manifesting TE, because in the shadow functions, TE is the sixth function of the INTP, and therefore that's what they must be manifesting. And the reason why they're manifesting TE instead of TI there is because they're really in shadow mode. Now, you think that this solidifies your position and allows you to avoid being contradicted, but all you're doing in the process is making your whole reasoning and the theory behind it pseudoscientific. And that's the circularity fallacy exemplified by the shadow function fallacy. So always be careful. My advice usually is stay away as much as possible from the whole shadow function thing. It's unverifiable, you can't observe it, it's only based on assumption, and it's usually used in defense of, dubious hypotheses that should really have been proven false. And if it's the case, that's okay. It doesn't mean the entire theory is worthless. So that's all for the 4 fallacies I wanted to discuss. Please let me know in the comments what you think, and if you have other examples, because there are probably many more. All right, see you guys. Enjoy your week.